1940 and taking 40 years in the building, St Mary's Church has endured for 8 centuries, providing an element of continuity throughout the changes by which an Anglo-Saxon community of some 100 inhabitants was transformed by events into a mid-20th century new town with a population of more than 80,000 people. It has literally overlooked the development of what was a rough track at the beginning of the 16th century into a prosperous market street in the 17th and 18th centuries, and then a thriving high street in the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Today, the church stands at the heart of a conservation area of historic buildings called the Old Town Centre, and it is within this contemporary scene that our walk into the past takes place. First, however, through photographs of paintings, a glimpse of Market Street when the 5 corn mills on the River Gade from water end to 2 waters were keeping up the town's reputation as the granary of London. The view from the churchyard at the rear of the market buildings, with the vicarage to the south of them. The street view of the market buildings, the butcher's shambles, the market house, women's market house, known as the Butter Market, the market hall and courthouse. A later view showing buildings on the east side. Of the several inns, the Bell was the last scheduled stop for the London to Leighton Buzzard stagecoach. Surprisingly, it was in the Bell that in 1786 the town's first Sunday school was established and run under the joint administration of Anglicans, Baptists and Quakers. Behind this stretch of Market Street, known by Victorian as Broadway, is seen the Free School, later known as the Grammar School, founded by Ashridge Monastery. The scene on the west side of the northern stretch of Market Street shows the church looking down on the Red Lion and the adjacent Old King's Head. On now to views of the Victorian High Street, beginning with the Town Hall, built in 1851 on the site of the Market Hall and Courthouse. At its southern end, the street looked down Bury Road, at the corner of which was the posting house from where the railway bus ran to Boxmoor Station with passengers and goods. The posting house overlooked Broadway, where on the right are the tethering posts for those coming on horseback to do business here, and on the left the entrance to the Bury grounds. On the right of the entrance, partly obscured by the combined drinking fountain and street lamp, is the fire engine shed. Lower High Street 100 years ago. The American oil stores, which had replaced the post office, were soon to make way for the building which is now Lloyd's Bank. Halfway along, the Rose and Crown Inn, whose yard gave access to the Baptist Church and the cattle market. Higher up, the Swan Inn yard led into the Phoenix Street, in which was Cranston's iron foundry. Opposite the Rose and Crown, Half Moon Inn, whose yard backed onto the Tide Barn and cottages. Josiah Brackett, stationer, bookseller, bookbinder and printer, demonstrated that a successful tradesman could also become a local worthy, to be treated by many as the equal of a gentleman. The view beyond the brow of the hill, showing the Lamb Inn and the Butcher's Shambles before their demolition to make way for a street improvement scheme. This was to provide office, shop and living accommodation and leave an open area, or the Market Square, between the new block and that comprising the Vestry Hall, Corn Exchange, Town Hall and Market House. And this was the Market Square before its removal from Marlowe's, with the coming of the new town, when it was renamed St Mary's Close. Finally, a view of the northern end of the street looking towards Pickett End, where still stands the one survivor of the 5 Rivergate Mill. Now to begin our walk of the contemporary scene, to learn its connections with the past, starting at the church, beneath whose fire time, like an ever-rolling stream, has borne away generation after generation of kinsfolk, among whom was many a village Hampden, whose protection of the quality of life of their day and its further enrichment gave succeeding generations reason to be grateful to history and encouraged them to treasure and enrich their heritage for the future. Now to go inside, to look at reminders of 2 families remembered for their considerable involvement in the spiritual life of the church and the material fortunes of the town. First, the memorial to the Astley Paston Cooper family, whose first baronet, a pupil of the most eminent surgeon of the 19th century, John Hunter, was knighted for his own services to his profession and the community. Then the memorial to the last survivor of the Coombe family, whose association with the Bury Manor house began when Francis Coombe first leased the building from Ashridge Monastery in 1535 and later bought it from the Crown. Below it are the lead coffin plates bearing the family armorial arms. We have come from the source of the town's spiritual development to the origins of its material prosperity. For these are the charter gardens, developed on the site of the Bury Manor house. It was here that King Henry VIII came at the invitation of his auditor, John Waterhouse, to meet influential figures in the local community, among whom was his cousin Richard Coombe. Here was sown the seed from which the town's fortunes grew. For in 1539 the town was granted a royal charter which gave it the status of a bailiwick for the right to hold a weekly market and an annual fair. All the remains of the replacement manor house built by Richard Coombe's ennobled grandfather is the stonework ruin known as the Charter Tower, which now affords access to the gardens. The extravagance of Sir Richard caused him to have to leave the Bury, which lay empty and uncared for, until it was beyond repair and demolished piecemeal to its present state. William Ginger, local attorney, built a new Bury house nearer to the River Gade, of which this is a painting. Through subsequent additions, the Bury took on its present appearance, with the inside adapted to suit its changing functions. It is now the Divisional Education Office. We will go on from here to visit Ken Bailey, who lives in the stretch which remains of Bury Road, which in 1909 looked like this when his father owned shops in the street, as did his grandfather in the days when the street was known as Pope's Lane, which boasted 3 pubs, the Six Bells, Nag's Head, and the Goats. Well, Ken, tell us first when you were born.
1894.
Yes, and where did you go to school?
To a ladies' kindergarten school in Alexander Road, age 5.
And where did you end your school days?
At a school known as East Browse, situated in East Lane.
Now, I understand that your father, as well as owning 2 shops, and they were over there, he, in fact, was a landlord, and he owned some houses in Bury Mill Hill, which is now called Bury Mill.
Yes.
They belonged to someone who lived at the Lockers, and he was going to demolish them and evict the tenants. And so your father bought them, is that so?
Yes, he wished to make a carriage drive with his father.
Really?
Namely Lockers.
And your mother collected the rent, did she?
Yes, I still have them booked, dating back to roughly 1912.
Well, now, normally, perhaps, Ken, we would have gone across the road to the mill, where you lived for 11 years in the mill house,
Yes.
and in fact where you worked for 2 years when you came back from the 1913-18 war.
Yes, oh yes.
And I believe you were using there in the mill a machine, a second-hand one, which came from Cranston's Phoenix work, and it was a very kind of machine you'd been working on in the army.
Yes, it was a Hornsby Stockport suction gas.
Well, what you know. Well, I'm sorry you can't come across the road with us then, Ken, but you just sit here and enjoy your memories, will you?
Thanks, I will.
Good.
Cheers.
Cheers. As we make our way back to the site of the mill and mill house to meet Tom Williams, one of Ken's friends, a view of those 2 buildings as they were in 1909, at which time Ken lived with his father in the mill house. Well, Tom, while you've been waiting, I expect your mind's been full of the 3 generations of Williams and their activity in this area. Tell me about them.
Certainly has, yes. The fortunes of the Williams family, such as they were, commenced here. We had the watercress beds here, which stretched almost to Gadebridge Lane. We were tenants of the Aston Bassey Cooper estate.
And what about this side?
That side, of course, this side was called the Berry Meadow before it. That side, in Elmer Road, yes, they were our own property there.
And then, of course, you had to move from here to the River Bulbourne with the coming of the new town.
We did indeed.
That gave you another connection, of course, with your father and your grandfather in that area. What was that?
Of course, you're referring to the Boxmoor Trust.
That's it.
Yes, well, of course, the Boxmoor Trust is very dear to me. Yes, it's a life a life version by public election, and a great heritage to the town, this new town, and unique.
Well, we could go on talking about that for a long time, but what we will advise you is to buy a copy of the book that was published in 1976 called This Is Your Heritage, and that'll give them more than you. I have crossed over from Queensway with Tom to the college campus, through which runs the River Gade, to talk to his friend Bill Brockett about their associations with the area. And what parts of the past have been coming back to you, Bill, while you've been waiting here?
Well, I was wondering how many people were there who could remember the house and shop that were at the corner of Elmer Road and Berry Road, which was right close to the Victorian College here. The shop was run by my father, and then, of course, by me. Having moved his original shop from the High Street, the northern end of the High Street, below the railings, he opened his shop in Berry Road. I doubt if any of his original customers are alive today. Originally, the Berry Road premises was a carpenter's shop, and this was opened by my father in 1914 as a retail shop. Our business at that time was chiefly retailing paraffin and hardware by means of a van to the surrounding area, and this allowed us to become very, very friendly with one and all. The shopkeepers in Berry Road, Cheapside and Broadway were more than neighbours. They were a very close-knit community, and their activities, although overlapping in some ways, was to the advantage of all.
Well, does that fit in with your feelings, Tom? Because, of course, you lived in this area for a long time, too.
It most certainly does, yes. Especially with both my grandparents lived within 100 yards of Bill's shop. And my mind immediately goes back to the old volunteer fire service, in which I followed my father and grandfather, with quite a few years' service, in fact, over 70 years' service between us. And the first fire shed, fire station, was built at the entrance to Gade Park, the first building in that row.
I have come to the northeast corner of the college campus to look down the one-time Bury Road, now part of Queensway, with the present-day Bury House on the right, the only building now surviving the changes brought about by the new town developments, to reflect on the scene at the turn of the century, when the posting house stood at the corner of Bury Road and Marlows. Having crossed over Queensway, I now look down Marlows and recall the row of buildings that stood here before they became the last to be demolished to make way for the college. It was known as Cheapside and reached as far as the Seabright Arms at the corner of Alma Road. I move along what was formerly Broadway to go to the White Hart, passing the building now occupied by Lloyd's Bank, the decorative stonework of which was done by Italian masons. The White Hart was once Coombe property, and to it was transferred the staircase of the abandoned Bury Manor House. In her private sitting room, I shall talk to Frances Basie, whose family has been in the brewing and victualling trade for several generations. It was her great-great-grandfather, Joe Goodhead, veteran maltster, who put Burton on the brewery map through his development of India Pale Ale in 1822. Well, there's no doubt about it, Francis, that when it comes to talk about heritage, you must say that next to the church, the pub has made a greater contribution to the life of the community than any other. And so it seemed very right and proper to come to the one pub where mine hostess had beer in her blood, as it were. How is the blood coursing through your veins now?
No froth on it. And
Yes.
you were quite right, he was Joe Goodhead was an ancestor of my great-great-great-grandfather, I think. And he brewed for all sorts,
and they were experimenting, and he got the beer that was eventually shipped out to the troops in India. India Pale Ale.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So really, you're quite right, I have got Polymerose very much.
Well, I gather then that after many successful, happy years in Burton, you were left the community for a while, but then you felt the urge to come back into the victualling trade. Tell me about that.
Well, after the RAF, during the war, my husband couldn't decide what he wanted to do, and I said, well, let's go back into the victualling trade and find somewhere that we can bring the family up and that we'd be happy. And our broker, we had a year just looking round, and our broker said, try Hemel Hempstead. There's a little old place there, and I think it was what you're after. So we came, we thought we conquered. And we decided that it was great possibilities, and it was an exciting project to see a new town evolve and to be members of it. This is what we did.
Yes, and when you say conquered, I mean, it's true that in fact there was a lot of resistance, first of all, to the integration of the old and the new.
Oh, yes.
It was a contribution of people like you who...
Well, we came new to this district, so there was no confliction there. And the community accepted us, and as it grew, we grew with them.
Yes.
Yes.
Of course, it's not trying to mention everything that you did. I mean, we could talk about the restaurant side of the service where you become an Egon Ronay place, but I think I'd sooner end by talking about Stanley, your husband, who unfortunately died last year, to say that you're leaving us now to go to another place to start a new life, and your last gesture, as it were, is to make a contribution to the Church of St. Mary's, which you very much appreciate.
Yes.
And I gather it's taking the form of some kind of alteration, restoration and improvement of the choir stalls.
Yes. And the reupholstering of the chancel chair.
And so life changes,
Yes.
inside the church changes, but the spirit goes on.
Oh,
And we're very grateful for the contribution that the White Hart and the family of the White Hart have made to the life of the town.
it's been a privilege.
I have come to the Friends Meeting House by way of the Rose and Crown Yard to pass the site of the Phoenix Iron Foundry, whose owner, Joseph Cranston, a leading Quaker, is buried in the meeting house grounds. The Quakers were among those who suffered religious persecution, and the local group first met in secret outside of parish bounds until they came here in 1718 to what was then Bell Lane to build their meeting house. I've come down from George Street into the King's Arms Yard, where in the days of the bailiwick market, travelling players, jugglers, acrobats entertained the public. The 17th century inn is pretty much as it was, but the uses of the buildings around it have changed with the changing times. I've come to meet Bill Johnson outside the offices, where he operates a design and planning consultancy, which he started as a one-man business 28 years ago. And Bill's a modest person and is a very reluctant contributor, but he's been involved in the enlargement and the renovation and the extension of so many buildings, many of them historic and architectural gems, that no film will be complete without it. So, Bill, against the background of your involvement in the changes in about 300 premises in this town, how do you feel about operating in such a controversial field?
I think with difficulty as ever. It's not an easy field. My hobby horse, as you know, is that we've got to take a more practical approach to preservation of buildings. I think everybody's got to take a more pragmatic view, and the planners, conservationists and the purists have got to realise that there has to be some change to make any sort of sense, and for the buildings to survive. We can't just allow them to become monuments for no particular purpose. The Georgians did it pretty well, so I can't see why we can't. It would be nice if we could, in the future, take a simple approach and try to do what we're going to do well.
I shall now go to St Mary's Close, the site of the Old Market Square, which is the focal point of today's conservation area, and it had been the hub of the prosperous High Street, seen from the churchyard. Here I shall talk to Gilbert Hitchcock, CBE, who was twice mayor and bailiff, and then leader of the Borough Council for 11 crucial years in the town development, and to Charles Kirk, OBE, town clerk from 1939 to 1974, when he was named a Freeman of the First. Well, first you, Gilbert, for your assessment of all these factors which were an influence on the development of the old town into the new town.
I think in talking about the success of the new town, there is a tendency to forget that in fact the foundations of that success were well and truly laid in the town hall which stands in front of us. Hemel Hempstead, as one of the first generations of new towns, was not like the others. It wasn't just a question of building factories, shops and houses on virgin sites. It was a town well established with a population of some 24,000, and one of the major problems was melding the old and the new together. So there were major problems, and I think the success depended upon three factors. One, that from day one, the Local Development Corporation of the local authority consciously sought to cooperate rather than to have conflict, there was cooperation. Secondly, I believe that we had in post, in the employ of the local authority, officers, chief officers in particular, who had the calibre, the expertise and the desire to make success of the venture. And thirdly, I think because of the challenge which it presented, we attracted to the membership of the local authority, regardless of party politics, people of the calibre necessary to carry out this tremendously demanding job. Because bear in mind, what we kaleidoscoped into a period of about 15 years would have taken the normal local authority perhaps a century to do. Those are my initial reactions. In fact, Charles would like to comment on that.
Well, I quite agree with what you said, Gilbert. It was very kind of you to make pleasant remarks about the officers, but we were there, we had the job to do, and we tried to do it to the best of our ability. Couldn't possibly have done it, though, unless the members of the council had, as Gilbert said, been a pretty good calibre themselves. But there were strong feelings locally about the new town, and this threw up a lot of members, candidates for election who were successful, and they made a jolly good team. They laid down the policy and let the officers get on with the work. We were happy with the Development Corporation, but that doesn't mean to say we didn't have flaming rows from time to time, mostly about money. But it all worked out in the end, and I think as a cooperative effort it's a success. There's a lot more I could say, of course, but I'd just like to make the point that the Borough Council played a real part in the partnership, and exercise very considerable influence, not always realised.
Before calling it the only shop in the High Street that has remained unchanged in appearance and use since it was built, a look at the rear of the building of which it is a part. As against changing hands 4 times in 95 years, it has changed its name but once, from Daisy Bell to Dinky Dell, which happened when the Barling family took over 25 years ago. And it is to meet Mrs. Anne-Marie Barling that I'll now go to that shop. Well, Madam Chairman, I think for the record I first make it clear that you've got a very full vested interest in the High Street. Now, first of all, there's a housewife who's a shopper here, and then there's what I would call a part-time assistant behind the counter in Dinky Dell, and then finally, of course, you are a councillor with a concern for its conservation. Now, there are a lot of people I know who are anxious, I'm sure you are too, that in fact we have lost already the basketry shop, the best known and the oldest established business in the High Street, and they're rather worried that it might happen to other shopkeepers. Now, because they do give such a courteous and personal service, that will be a pity. What are your feelings about the High Street and your hopes for its future as a commercial area and a conservation area in the last 2 decades of the 20th century?
Well, Clifford, I believe that shopping trends are changing, but there will always be a place for the small shopkeeper. But the proprietors must get a reasonable return on capital employed if we're to survive. It is rising overheads as a whole set against the drop in public spending at the moment, which are causing difficulties for shopkeepers as a whole. The council certainly hopes that the name once given to this street, Dead Man's Creek, will never return.
While Dinky Dell stood firm, across the road, the hardware and ironmongery shop of Gade, itself a combination of 2 adjacent premises, which once housed the Lord Nelson and Angel Pub, underwent a dramatic reconstruction to provide once again two separate shops, which were recently combined into one.
Well, Peter, I think your reputation is such because you're well known and appreciated for all the illustrations you've done to the articles in the local press and local history over the years. And I'm sure that, in fact, people would consider you perhaps to be the authentic voice of the High Street. What about that? I have in mind in particular, of course, the series Behind the Scenes in the High Street.
Yes, Clifford. Well, somebody said, I think it was John Betjeman, that this was the finest street in Hertfordshire, and certainly the painter, I would agree with that. It's a marvellous street to paint. The way the buildings are stacked up the hill, curving to the left, is visually very exciting, and the southern view you get of the church, magnificent Norman church, is quite overpowering if you've never seen it before. And then the street comes along quietly, and suddenly these cottages here that we're sitting in front of are revealed below the railings here. And I think this is quite unique. I know of no other street like this. And again, marvellous to paint. And the Sun Inn opposite here, which is the property we occupy, is a good example of the conservation that has gone on here. It was a pub until about 1960, from its beginning in 1700. And it was only changed to bring it up to date interiorly for retailing purposes and to comply with the public health regulations. The exterior has remained the same since it was built, and all that's taken place is conservation.
One of the features of the High Street, particularly in Victorian days, were the streets and alleyways that led off from the main street and led into very interesting yards, each of whom had their distinctive name, mostly named after the person who lived either in the yard or at the entrance to the yard. And I've come into here now from Sun Square into Armstrong Place, which is featured in the book, The History of Hemel Hempstead.
This is a view of Armstrong Yard 100 years ago, showing washerwoman Perry outside her cottage, taking a respite, basking in the sun, possibly gathering her strength to go along to the nearest available pump for fresh water. Had it been at the top of the High Street, this is the view she would have had on her way there. This is the view that meets us today, and the area in which the combined street lamp and drinking fountain, made by Joseph Cranston, is sited, has been pleasingly landscaped and provided with an unusual mural attraction. I shall now make my way up the lane along which Queen Mary's soldiers conveyed Princess Elizabeth from Ashridge to the Tower of London. Its name, Cherry Bounce, had its origins in circumstances connected with a goodwill visit to France by King Henry VIII. It was changed to Cross Street by the builder of the two-room cottages, which were eventually condemned and demolished, and the name restored. So into and across Townsend Field, in which recent landscape improvements created hillocks which provide strategic vantage points from which to view the considerable scenic delights of this area of the town, of which all too many are unaware apparently. Naturally, St Mary's Church dominates the general view, looking back over the town, with Kodak House fittingly seen in the background. I move on to a higher vantage point for a panoramic view of Gade Park, to applaud the Borough Council's action in acquiring a considerable area of it that now makes a vital contribution to the leisure and recreational needs of the new town community. A generous dowry which has contributed to the general success of the arranged marriage of the old borough with the new town, you might say. Looking towards Pickett's End, Martin's house is seen in the foreground and Pickett's End Mill in the far distance. A view of some modernised cottages and then the medieval cottages where Sir Astley Paston Cooper established the country's first cottage hospital in 1826. The building now houses a museum whose central features are the unique 15th century wall paintings and the collection of historic medical equipment. Pickett End Mill, the only survivor of the fire once found on the River Gade, is still a working mill, but using electric and not water power, and producing animal feed, not flour. Some 300 yards away is a pumping station built to extract the water which forms a lake beneath Pickett End to supply the new town needs. Now from my vantage point, I pick out Marchmont Cottage, a one-time tannery which served as a secret meeting place for Baptists when they were subjected to religious persecution. And now I move my attention to focus on Kodak Market and Education Centre, completed in 1973 at a cost of £1 million. This was built on the site of Gade House, the Paston Cooper family seat, whose last use before demolition was a boys' boarding school. And this is a view of Gade Lane as it was then, a forded road which crossed the River Gade with a footbridge for pedestrians leading to the entrance drive, with a lodge showing behind the bridge. Gadebridge Park is not only a place to admire scenically, but even more a place for individual, family, group and general public enjoyment at all times of the year. At no time is the popular side of its attractions more evident, however, than at the summer carnival. This is the 20th century version of the annual statute fair, whose beginning goes back, as does the prosperity of the town, nearly 450 years, to the grant of the King Henry VIII Charter. Then, as now, the fair took place under the watchful eye of the church, which even now is beckoning me on to complete the walk beneath its spire. So, with my mind full of recollections this walk has stirred, of what the past continues to contribute to the present, I make my way back to and down the northern stretch of the High Street, seeing it in my mind's eye as it was at the turn of the century. The smoke has now gone from the street, but can we say any more clearly the central truth of which the spire of St. Mary's Church is a constant reminder, that man cannot live by bread alone. To care for the future of the church is to care for the future of man.
Although the graveyard has been landscaped in recent times, there's still a reminder of the people of the past by the gravestones which have been lined up against the wall. It is a very timely reminder to bear in mind that history is about people, not about places and events.